The Utah War, a forgotten American conflict. Introduction. A land on the brink. The year was 1857, and the United States was on the precipice of internal strife. The nation was already simmering with tensions over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion, but few Americans realized that a separate crisis was unfolding in the remote Utah Territory, a land of vast deserts, towering mountains, and a people who felt betrayed by their own country. For the Mormon settlers, the Utah Territory was their sanctuary, a place where they had sought refuge after years of violent persecution in the eastern United States. To them, the federal government's sudden decision to send troops to Utah was not just a political maneuver, it was an existential threat. To President James Buchanan, however, Utah had become a rogue state, openly defying federal authority. He saw Brigham Young, the Mormon leader and territorial governor, as a rebel theocrat who needed to be replaced by force if necessary. What followed was a tense, year-long military confrontation between the U.S. Army and the Mormon settlers, one that could have escalated into full-scale war, but instead became a strategic standoff that shaped the future of the American West. Tensions rise. The road to conflict. Brigham Young's theocratic rule. In 1847, Brigham Young led tens of thousands of Mormon pioneers across the Great Plains and into the isolated deserts of Utah. Fleeing religious persecution from Illinois, Missouri, and Ohio, Young sought a place where his people could govern themselves without outside interference. The Great Basin, though inhospitable to most settlers, became the heart of Mormon civilization. Under Young's leadership, the Mormons established Salt Lake City and dozens of smaller settlements, creating a highly organized, cooperative society. Young ruled Utah not just as a religious leader but as a political one. His control over the territory was absolute. He dictated laws, settled disputes, and even commanded the Nauvoo Legion, Utah's militia. To the federal government, however, Young's rule was problematic. Reports from non-Mormon officials stationed in Utah painted a picture of defiance and lawlessness. Rumors spread in Washington that Young had established a theocracy, punished dissenters with death, and defied federal authority. Some claimed that Utah had become a breakaway state, unwilling to follow the Constitution. President Buchanan's decision to intervene. By 1857, tensions between Utah and Washington had reached a breaking point. When federal judges fled Utah, claiming they had been intimidated by Mormon leaders, Buchanan saw it as evidence of rebellion. Without consulting Young or the Mormons, he ordered 2,500 U.S. Army soldiers under the command of Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston to march to Utah and install a new territorial governor, Alfred Cumming, to replace Brigham Young. But Buchanan had miscalculated. He failed to communicate his intentions, and to the Mormons, the sight of an advancing U.S. Army force felt like an invasion. #the Mormon response. Preparing for war. Brigham Young declares martial law. When news of the Army's approach reached Salt Lake City in July 1857, Brigham Young reacted with defiance. Fearing a repeat of the Mormon massacres in Missouri and Illinois, he declared martial law, forbade federal troops from entering Utah, and mobilized the Nauvoo Legion for defense. Though outnumbered and outgunned, Young knew a direct battle with the U.S. Army would be disastrous. Instead, he ordered his men to engage in guerrilla tactics, harassing supply lines, burning grasslands, and destroying key resources to slow the Army's advance. The Nauvoo Legion's guerrilla campaign. Under the command of Lot Smith, Mormon raiders launched a brilliant campaign of sabotage. They set fire to supply wagons, leaving Johnston's troops without food or shelter. They stole cattle, depriving the army of much-needed provisions. They burned grasslands, ensuring that horses and oxen would starve. As Johnston's army struggled through the harsh Wyoming wilderness, they found themselves outmaneuvered by a militia that refused to fight conventionally. Winter stops the army. By October 1857, Johnston's army was bogged down by Mormon resistance and an early winter. The harsh conditions, combined with the Mormons' scorched-earth tactics, forced the army to halt near Fort Bridger, where they were stranded in the snow, hungry and demoralized. Rather than facing the Mormons in open battle, they spent the winter cold, starving, and waiting for reinforcements. The resolution: a peaceful end. By early 1858, Buchanan realized that the Utah War was turning into an embarrassment. The Mormon resistance had proven far more effective than anticipated, and the American public questioned the necessity of sending an army against fellow citizens. To avoid a costly, prolonged conflict, Buchanan sent a peace delegation to negotiate with Brigham Young. In exchange for a full pardon, Young agreed to step down as governor and allow Alfred Cumming to take his place. Though Johnston's army eventually marched into Salt Lake City, they found no resistance. The Mormons had abandoned the city to avoid bloodshed. The Utah War ended without a single major battle, but its consequences were far-reaching. The aftermath and legacy. The impact on Mormon-U.S. relations. Though war had been avoided, the Mormons remained deeply distrustful of the U.S. government. Many believed Buchanan had acted in bad faith, and tensions between Utah and Washington would continue for years. By 1869, however, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad brought more federal oversight, gradually integrating Utah into the broader American political system. Foreshadowing the Civil War. The Utah War was a precursor to the American Civil War, demonstrating how an unpopular federal military intervention could divide the nation. How guerrilla tactics and strategic resistance could defeat a larger, better-equipped army. How federal authority could be challenged by local governments, a conflict that would erupt again just a few years later. A forgotten conflict. Despite its significance, the Utah War remains largely forgotten. It was an early test of federal power, a cultural and religious struggle, and a reminder of America's complicated expansionist history. Today, when one walks the historic sites of Utah, the echoes of 1857 still linger, a testament to the power of faith, resilience, and the fragile nature of unity. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, a dark chapter in American history. Prelude to tragedy, fear and paranoia in Utah. By September 1857, Utah was in a state of near hysteria. The looming invasion of federal troops had pushed Brigham Young and his followers into a siege mentality. Convinced that the United States sought their destruction, the Mormon leadership declared martial law, fortified settlements, and cut off communication with outsiders. The arrival of a wagon train of emigrants from Arkansas only fueled the paranoia. This group, known as the Baker Fancher Party, was a large and well-equipped caravan of men, women, and children journeying westward toward California. Like thousands before them, they followed the old Spanish Trail, which passed through southern Utah, a region dominated by Mormon settlements. Normally, such wagon trains were welcomed as a source of trade, but in the charged atmosphere of 1857, the Arkansas emigrants found themselves unwanted and suspected. Rumors and rising hostility. Several factors contributed to the hostility toward the Baker Fancher Party. Arkansas connections. News had recently reached Utah that Parley P. Pratt, a prominent Mormon leader, had been murdered in Arkansas. Many Mormons blamed Arkansans for his death and saw the wagon train as representatives of an enemy state. Fears of espionage. With federal troops approaching, local Mormon leaders feared that the emigrants might be spies, sent to gather intelligence or even aid the U.S. Army. Economic tensions. Some Utah settlers resented outsiders passing through without trading, seeing them as draining resources while contributing nothing. Religious isolation. The Mormon Church's rhetoric had become increasingly defensive, portraying outsiders as enemies of God. In this climate, simple misunderstandings could quickly escalate into deadly confrontations. The situation worsened when local Mormons refused to sell supplies to the emigrants, forcing them to rely on dwindling provisions. Frustrations grew, and heated exchanges reportedly took place. By the time the Baker Fancher Party reached Mountain Meadows, a remote valley in southern Utah, their fate had already been sealed by a tragic mix of fear, misinformation, and radicalization. The massacre begins. A conspiracy takes shape. The role of the Mormon militia. The decision to attack the emigrants was made by local Mormon leaders in Cedar City, led by Isaac Haight and John D. Lee. They consulted Brigham Young, but before his response could reach them, the militia had already set their plans in motion. They enlisted Paiute Indian allies, convincing them that the emigrants were enemies who needed to be eliminated. At dawn on September 7, 1857, gunfire erupted in Mountain Meadows. The emigrants, caught off guard, quickly formed a defensive wagon circle and dug trenches to protect themselves. They repelled several attacks, suffering casualties, but managing to hold their ground. For 5 days, the Baker-Fancher party fought for survival in the valley. The deception and the final massacre. As the stalemate dragged on, the Mormon militia devised a cruel deception. On September 11th, John D. Lee and his men approached the emigrants under a white flag. They promised safe passage if the settlers would lay down their arms and allow themselves to be escorted away. Desperate and out of options, the emigrants agreed to surrender. They were led out in separate groups, men first, then women and children, each escorted by an armed Mormon militia member. Then, at a prearranged signal, the Mormon guards turned on their captives and opened fire. The men were executed first, gunned down at point-blank range. The women and older children were slaughtered next, many begging for mercy as they were stabbed or shot. Only 17 children, all under the age of 7, were spared, presumably because they were too young to remember the attack. By the time the bloodshed ended, more than 120 men, women, and children lay dead. The bodies were left to rot, picked apart by wolves and vultures, while the Mormon militia attempted to cover up the atrocity. Aftermath, shock and denial. Brigham Young's response. When Brigham Young finally received word of the massacre, he was horrified, but also pragmatic. He denied direct involvement, but took no immediate action against those responsible. Instead, he ordered a cover-up, instructing Mormons not to speak about the massacre. For years, local officials blamed the Paiute Indians, claiming that Mormon settlers had tried, but failed, to prevent the attack. National outrage and government investigation. When news of the Mountain Meadows Massacre reached the East, it shocked the nation. Though the Utah War had ended peacefully, the massacre intensified anti-Mormon sentiment across the United States. By the 1870s, after the Civil War had ended, the federal government reopened the investigation. John D. Lee, the only person ever held accountable, was arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad in 1877, 2 decades after the crime. Yet, many of the other perpetrators escaped justice, and the massacre remains a deeply sensitive subject in Mormon history. The war's end, a bloodless resolution. By 1858, with both sides exhausted, President Buchanan sought a peaceful resolution. A pardon was offered to Brigham Young and the Mormons in exchange for their submission to federal authority. On June 26, 1858, Johnston's army finally entered Salt Lake City, only to find it deserted. Fearing violence, Young had ordered the Mormons to evacuate south, leaving the army to camp outside the city. Instead of conquest, the U.S. Army simply established a fort, asserting federal presence but avoiding direct conflict. Legacy, a conflict that shaped a nation. Lessons from the Utah War. Though the Utah War ended without major battles, it shaped the future of American expansion and religious freedom. For the Mormons, it reinforced their identity as a persecuted people. For the U.S. government, it set a precedent for handling territorial resistance. For America, it was a preview of the tensions that would erupt into the Civil War just a few years later. Remembering the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Today, the graves at Mountain Meadows remain a somber reminder of how fear and prejudice can lead to unspeakable violence. The massacre was not just a tragedy, but a moment of reckoning, one that forced both Mormons and the nation to confront the darker aspects of their past. Final thoughts. The Forgotten War. The Utah War was a war without a battlefield, but its legacy still lingers in the deserts of Utah. It was a war fought in fear, a battle of survival, and a moment in history where an entire people stood at the edge of war and stepped back, just in time. Yet, as history has shown, some wars do not need great battles to change the course of a nation. The Utah War, though bloodless in its resolution, was one of them. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and become a part of our community. Here, you'll find historical wars, inspiring stories, and unique content based on real events. If you want to see more engaging and fact-based stories, hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos instantly. Your support means the world to us. Leave a comment and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover next. Raising hands fire. Bell, subscribe, share, and help us bring these incredible stories to the world.